Does the term bad boy for life still ring true for Sean Combs, aka Diddy? Is he feeling remorseful for his past actions that have him still facing a years-long prison sentence, even though he's been found not guilty on the more serious charges he once faced? Great questions, right? Well, according to new reports, it seems like the Bad Boy Records founder is seeking help while still locked up in a detention center. So is this a self-reckoning, or is it a ploy to look good for the judge?
Diddy's world didn't just crack tonight, it collapsed. Violently, brutally, and in a way that left even the hardest prisoners staring in disbelief. Whatever thin layer of protection he thought he still had inside those walls, gone, completely gone, because tonight,
They change him, or at least maybe change his team for the future? Well, hard to tell, but according to reports, he signed himself up for self-help therapy programs to address his drug use and violence against women. By this point, we all know Sean Combs was found not guilty of RICO conspiracy and sex trafficking his former girlfriends Cassie and the woman known in his trial as Jane. I saw and heard both these women testify myself, and let's just say some of their testimony, I don't know if I'll be able to get it out of my brain. But maybe what they testified to actually struck a chord with Diddy. According to a report by TMZ, their sources say Sean Combs enrolled himself into a STOP program at MDC Brooklyn. So what's the STOP program? It's a course for inmates with the focus of preventing sexual assault, domestic violence, and dating violence. Oh, and per those same reports, he's reportedly undergoing therapy and in a drug abuse program reportedly conducted by Dr. Harry X. Wexler. Now, during the trial, we heard a lot about drugs: ketamine, cocaine, weed, molly, shrooms, GHB, 2C, or pink cocaine. Federal prosecutors said previously drugs were a key ingredient for the freak-offs or hotel nights or wild king nights, whatever you want to call them. Meanwhile, the defense claimed Sean Combs struggled with drug addiction, and any drug use was just personal and for private use. And we heard a testimony about the rampant drug use too, from Cassie and Jane, where they both claimed they couldn't go through freak-offs or hotel nights without drugs, to the many assistants like Mia or George Kaplan, or even Brendan Paul, where they observed Sean Combs doing drugs. Some even partook in drugs to prove their loyalty, or picked up drugs on Combs' behalf. Or the many of text messages shown about drug costs, reimbursements for drugs, etc. Then another theme that played throughout the trial was the excruciating amount of testimony about domestic violence, especially during Combs' relationship with Cassie. I mean, we all saw the Intercontinental Hotel surveillance tape. We heard the subsequent apology after portions of the footage were released publicly. But we also heard about violence toward Jane, and Combs' former assistant Mia, and Cassie's stylist Deontay, and Cassie's former best friend Carrie Morgan. The defense even owned up to the domestic violence many times during the trial, something even the judge used as part of the reason to keep Combs locked up pending sentencing. The judge said during the bond hearing, at trial the defense conceded defendant's violence in a personal relationship, saying it happened in relation to Cassie Ventura and Jane. Judge Subramanian even pointed out there was violent and illegal conduct even after the HSI raids on his homes, saying that this highlights a disregard for the rule of law and a propensity of violence. But according to the report by TMZ, their source says Combs wants to use their jail programs to better himself. But there are skeptics of Combs' motivation to do the programs now. Is it too little too late, or does this polish him up for the judge so Mark Agnifilo can say in court, "Look, Your Honor, my client did these programs. He wants to be a better man"? I mean, I wouldn't put it past Mark Agnifilo to say that at the upcoming sentencing hearing. He said something along those lines of this when he was making arguments for Sean Combs to get bond after the verdict. Now, Combs reportedly started getting drug treatment before his arrest last year, even though the feds say he was found with drugs in his hotel room the night he was arrested. And Mark Agnifilo previously said Jane helped Diddy get into a batterers program before his ultimate arrest. We'll see if the self-work paid off, or if it's too little too late when Combs is ultimately sentenced in less than 3 months. Well, I'm joined now by trial attorney Adante Pointer. Adante, always great to see you. Is it no longer bad boy for life? What are your thoughts on these courses that Sean Combs is reportedly enrolled in? Are you buying that it's actually making him a better person, or do you think it's just trying to make him look better in front of the judge before sentencing?
Well, I think two things can be true at the same time. One is, yes, those courses are designed.
for the first time since stepping through those gates, Diddy learned exactly what it means to fight for survival when every single person around you smells blood in the water. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a scuffle. This wasn't two dudes bumping into each other and losing their temper. This was a full-on assassination attempt inside a tiny concrete box with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no one who gave a damn whether he lived or died. It started with a sound he'd been hearing a lot lately, whispers outside his cell, footsteps that slowed down when they reached his door, eyes watching him like he was prey. Ever since the charges, the lawsuits, the raids, the videos, and all the dark stories bubbling up from the underground, he became a walking target, a trophy, a message, a payday. Tonight, that message came through loud and clear. He was sitting on his bunk, trying to calm the exhaustion that had been beating him down for days, when the lights flickered, just once, quick, but enough to make his stomach drop, enough to make him stand up and turn his head toward the door. Then it happened, a shadow moved in the hall.
They're instituted, they give inmates, if you will, access to those courses because the belief is those courses will help, a person's behavior and curb them from doing things that would find them in front of a judge. I also could see that serving a dual purpose. Second purpose being it makes you look much better in front of the judge. As I told all my clients, if you're doing things that the court can recognize that is actually helping you deal with the behavior that puts you in front of the judge in the first place. So here, violence against women, domestic violence is something that the courts is a big no-no in society as well as the court. And so I can see the fact that he's taking these classes being something that the judge will take into consideration during his sentencing. And on top of that, the drug class is the same thing because I believe, if I was Diddy's attorney and given the way the evidence came in, I'd certainly be like, look, these things happen during dark times where I was in a drug, induced haze to where I was doing and acting in ways that I am ashamed about now. But during that time, it was because drug, sex addiction, and things like that I'm now addressing.
Well, you actually kind of sound like Diddy's defense attorney, Mark Agnifilo, because he literally made essentially the exact same argument, especially during the bond hearing. But I'm curious to know, obviously there are skeptics of this where they think it's strictly just to look good, it's just for good press, all of that stuff. Yeah. But in your opinion, do you think that these courses are just too little too late? I mean, the defense was saying that he was trying to get help before, he was trying to get help to address his drug use previously, that Jane was helping him get into a batterers program. But do you think it's too little too late?
Well, it's too little too late for his victims, okay? But it's not too little too late for the rest of the people he's going to encounter while he continues to live out the rest of his life. And so you can't slam the door on redemption. You can't slam the door on someone trying to address destructive behavior. So I think, he does get some kudos for enrolling in the program and for the efforts he made prior to finding himself in federal court facing all of those charges. So I think it does go to his credit, but you're right. Critics and skeptics, sometimes they'll just never be satisfied. And for, well-founded reasons. When you have someone who has a documented history such as him and you see the videos and you hear the testimony, his problem goes deeper than a 30-day, program. Not that these programs are 30 days, but just to say it's going to take long-term and commitment to the long-term results in order for us to really have confidence that he's not going to engage in such disturbing behavior.
And it's interesting too, because I think the public reaction to this verdict was really kind of split down the middle. I was really thinking it was going to be one way. I was at the courthouse. It was a completely different kind of beast and animal that was going on after the verdict happened. There were people with the baby oil. It was a crazy day after the verdict happened. But I know some analysts were kind of comparing it to the O.J. Simpson verdict, but it seemed like the reaction was really kind of split down the middle. A lot of people upset with the jury's decision, but then there were a lot surprisingly celebrating the verdict. What are your thoughts?
Well, my entire
hallway, too close, too deliberate. Before he could even shout for the guard, the cell door swung open, not slowly, not quietly, but with the force of intention. 2 inmates rushed in. Eyes locked, jaws clenched, bodies tense like coiled wires ready to snap. One held a shank, crude, sharp, wrapped with torn fabric. The other, just fists and rage. But in prison, fists alone can end a life. Diddy backed up instantly, hands up, pleading, bargaining, begging. None of it mattered. They didn't come to talk. They didn't come to scare him. They came to end him. The first attacker lunged fast and viciously. The blade slashed across his arm, tearing through skin before he even registered the pain. He screamed, loud, raw, terrified. They didn't stop. Another strike. Then another. He stumbled backward, hit the metal frame of the bunk, slipped, and fell hard onto the floor. The two attackers cornered him instantly. One pinned his legs, slamming a knee.
Time looking at the case, the charges, and listening, to the evidence as it came in during trial, I thought that depending upon how a person, be it a juror, be it the public, comes into the trial believing how someone who's a victim should act and how they believe relationships can evolve or devolve and fall apart, is the lens that they would then make their verdict. Why I say that is because if you think a person who's battered, someone who's been a victim, someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described, most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting, you don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what, that's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits, and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous, and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict does not is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic, to be more
into his ribs. The other raised the shank high, aiming for the stomach, the kill zone. Diddy twisted, kicked, clawed, did whatever he could to keep that blade from sinking deeper into him. But the blade still came down, slicing across his side, warm blood spilling immediately. He shouted for help. He screamed for the guards. But inside a prison, screams are background noise. The beating intensified, punches to the head, kicks to the ribs, the blade flashing over and over, carving fear into every inch of him. His breathing became sharp, his ears rang, his vision blurred. Every second felt like it might be his last as the attackers kept going, not slowing down, not losing steam, driven by a mission someone had clearly ordered. Then the alarm finally went off. Guards stormed the hallway, shouting, rushing, keys rattling. The attackers tried to strike him one last time before they were dragged away screaming, cursing, still trying to lunge at him as officers wrestled them into restraints.
In the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the Standalone Man Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale was. In other words, there is a significant issue at the MDC related to the safety of employees and incarcerated individuals that require outside law enforcement action from multiple agencies to address. Importantly, MDC, as a jail, has a significant law enforcement presence within its walls 24 hours per day that are equipped with investigatory and often unregulated authority. Thus, the requirement of outside law enforcement agencies to ensure safety within the MDC is an admission that serious violence, mayhem, and chaos is occurring within the MDC that requires more than a Band-Aid raid, but rather surgery. Indeed, we are aware of ongoing threats of violence and actual violence in the facility such that Mr. Combs' safety is constantly at risk. And they go on to argue, though Mr. Combs has been a model inmate for his nearly year-long period of confinement, the violent conditions are still very much a concern for Mr. Combs and is an unnecessary confinement.
Diddy lay on the floor shaking uncontrollably, blood pooling under him, eyes wide, chest heaving. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. The guards had to lift him onto a stretcher as other inmates crowded their cell windows, yelling wild things, laughing, taunting, celebrating. Because to them, this wasn't a tragedy. It was entertainment. It was dominance. It was hierarchy. And watching a powerful man fall is the biggest show you can get behind bars. In the medical wing, nurses pressed gauze against his wounds, stitched the cuts, checked for internal bleeding. The entire time, he couldn't stop trembling. He kept looking at the door as if someone else might rush in, kept asking security if they were sure he was safe, kept muttering, "They're coming back, they're coming back." For the first time since his arrest, Diddy looked like a man who finally understood the truth. Inside prison, fame means nothing. Money means nothing. Connections mean nothing. Only survival matters. And tonight, he barely
highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent. Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. I mean, they had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off, and I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual nature of this particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been in prison, or jail rather, for like 11 months. This case is a one-off to begin with, but we're not aware of any case like this with a Mann Act conviction where anyone's done that much time to begin with. So.
And prosecutors, I'm imagining, have come back or will come back and say, well, listen, look, after the raids on his property, he engaged, or what they would say, he allegedly engaged in criminal activity and, obviously violence, they say, with Jane. But they say, look, what was in his hotel room when he was picked up in New York. They made allegations of what he was trying to do while he was in the MDC, whether it was using other inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls. That was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago. But how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I mean, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, I mean, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time. And I think one of the good things and positive things that has come out of his incarceration. It's given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance. And he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So, I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that. And I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear,
survived. His legal team rushed in moments later, faces pale, voices frantic, asking questions the guards couldn't answer. Who did this? Who ordered it? Was it gang retaliation? Was it personal? Was it connected to the cases on the outside? The truth was simple. No one knew. And worse, no one could guarantee it wouldn't happen again. Because once a hit is attempted inside prison, it never stops with one. If the first one fails, the second comes harder. If the second fails, the third comes smarter. Word spread through the prison within minutes. Some inmates were shocked. Some applauded. Some started plotting, wondering how much they could get if someone else wanted another attempt carried out. Diddy wasn't in fear anymore, he was in full-blown survival mode. Every breath hurt. Every movement stung. Every shadow made him flinch. It all started with tension that had been building for weeks. Diddy had been walking around with a target on his back ever since he got
clear. My understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission. And he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we've talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. There were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitute.
Locked up. The cases, the allegations, the headlines, the drama, it all followed him inside. In prison, reputation doesn't help you, it endangers you. And lately, the energy around him had been shifting, whispering, staring, people moving differently when he walked by. He felt it but tried to convince himself he was imagining things. He wasn't. Everything exploded late at night, the kind of time when guards get lazy and inmates start plotting. Diddy was in his cell, exhausted, emotionally drained, barely keeping it together, when he heard footsteps outside his door, but not the normal pattern of guards. These steps were slow, heavy, coordinated. Straight violence. The first man went at him with a shank, a sharpened piece of metal wrapped tightly with cloth. The second one blocked the door, ready to make sure Diddy had no way out and no chance to scream for help. Diddy jumped up and tried to shield himself, but the first strike came fast, a slice across his shoulder that instantly drew blood. He stumbled back, shocked, confused, scared out of his mind. He tried to shout, but the second attacker lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Punches started raining down. The shank flashed again. Another stab. Then another. Blood hit the floor. Diddy's breathing turned sharp and panicked. His hands were shaking as he tried to grab the attacker's wrist. But this wasn't a fight, it was a mission. The attackers moved like they were following instructions. Precise, focused, no wasted motion. They weren't trying to scare him. They were trying to end him. Diddy slipped, fell to the ground, and the attackers pounced. One held his legs down while the other raised the blade again, aiming for his ribs, the kind of strike that's meant to take you out permanently. He twisted. He kicked. He shouted. But adrenaline only buys you so much time. The blade stabbed down, tearing into his side. He screamed in pain, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the hallway. Finally, someone heard the noise. An alarm blared. Guards began sprinting. The attackers tried to finish the job before they were caught, but officers stormed the cell and ripped them away from him. They dragged the inmates out kicking and shouting while Diddy lay on the floor, bleeding and shaking uncontrollably. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling from shock. He begged for protective custody. He demanded a transfer. He told everyone willing to listen, "They're going to kill me in here." And for once, it wasn't arrogance talking. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't drama. It was reality. Cold, brutal, sprayed across the floor of his cell in blood. Diddy's prison nightmare wasn't coming, it had arrived. With a blade. With a beating. With a message. And someone out there wants to make sure the next time, he doesn't get back up.